Welcome everyone. This is our first City of York Housing Delivery Program online gathering. My name is Angela and I'm your host for today. Thank you so much for joining the discussion. We are meeting today to talk about the design of the homes and spaces planned at Ordnance Lane could nurture intergenerational living, working and volunteering. I trust you found the insights shared by our wonderful speakers stimulating and thought-provoking. May I ask Lisa, in her role as City of York project lead for the Ordnance Lane planning application, to kick us off with her initial thoughts, please.
Gaining by sharing, connecting in some way, perhaps if it's by the external space or by a physical connection. I know that logistically it's quite difficult because there are some beautiful mature trees there which we're trying to retain. So that might be something that we sort of look to challenge our design team to try to resolve.
So like a staircase in the tree, so you can cross from one building to the other.
That would be perfect, a Tarzan swing.
Kew Gardens there in London, where you can walk sort of through the trees. It was a wonderful experience. Who would like to sort of share his or her ideas about the sort of external spaces and how they could be nurtured in our context of Ordnance Lane? Richard? Hi, Richard.
You know, you can put in certain beds, but then allowing the residents to kind of adapt it for themselves. There's not too much regimented there. Examples being what they did in East Leeds with the council there, and it's almost a community thing of getting the younger residents working with the older generation to create the beds. And that's gives a kind of buy-in, and even if it's the young juvenile delinquent, so to speak, they still want to do it because it's a kind of a macho thing of who can lift more from them and their friends, and it actually creates community. I find that it's not overly planned.
Sweat equity that you can bring in. Landscape structures are probably a bit of an easier task early on.
Kind of climate resilient for York as well. So looking into building materials, we're looking at building a circular economy and one planet living model. Can the area still look pretty when people aren't bothered doing it? Got in my local neighbourhood them to do kind of front to back gardens, which is an interesting project everyone should look up. But the key thing there is like using spaces is making sure you've got access to hoses to water the plants so people aren't having to traipse water everywhere, but then seeing what plants don't need a lot of maintenance. Thing to build in as well is remember there's a lot of the Maggie centres, they build in these sensory gardens for older generations, because especially when you start getting dementia, actually it's the smells that bring back memories and these kind of things as well. So building in that kind of sensory element that allows people to just, pick plants, and if you pick them, they grow back, more bushy as well.
And I think this is an interesting aspect of this isolation we're all sort of living more or less in at the moment. Joy you get in nature. Outdoor water access. Hi, Margaret.
Okay. Hi. I just want to mention a couple of things. One of them that both of these things have just sort of developed naturally. One of them is that I live in a block of flats on the corner of Alma Terrace and Fulford Road. So we'll be nearby neighbors. And we have a communal garden that outside. And we have a mix of residents. Some people own their flats, some people rent their flats. There are multi-ages, there are people, there was a newborn baby born last week, and we have a resident who's 86. So we have about half of the flats are owned by older people and some middle-aged and some younger people. And what happens is that as people age, their level of involvement varies, and the way they participate varies. So that the very young people, they're all busy with their families and everything, and they're less involved in sort of looking after the garden. We have a maintenance committee of people who own their flats and live in their flats. That helps reduce the costs. The elderly people, gives them some input into it, but after they reach a certain age, they don't have the energy to put into it anymore, and they're happy to sit in their living room and look out the window and watch the younger elders do a lot of the gardening. A community that has just developed.
How many people live there all together?
There are 18 flats, and I don't know exactly how many people. About half of them are living with single people, either single young people or single elders. About half of them are single men, half of them are single women, maybe a few more single women. So there are about half of them are couples, or about a third of them, and a third of them are families. They're all 2-bedroom flats.
We're not designing for a particular moment in time, in a particular mix. You kind of want to create a space that can sort of grow with the population, and the new ones, the babies coming, elderly will die, and then the house will be occupied by a different kind. How long have you been sort of involved in the committee? And
I've lived here 12 years, and I've been on the committee for about 8 years. 6 to 8 years. Yeah. I'm the treasurer currently. And so, and we organize all of the painting and the maintenance and the window washing and all of that. And we consult with the neighbors, and we have, there's a lot of input. Try to engage the neighbors, the residents in participating and making decisions. We just had the garages, and we just had them painted a different color, and so we consulted with people about what they would like. And so it's very, very communal, but it isn't something that's organized from the beginning. It's just emerged that way.
Yeah. A little bit like the example Lydia mentioned at the end, where the spaces just seem to be sort of working and people start occupying them, and maybe, and I don't know who had first the idea to kind of do this communally. Maybe it was born out of a necessity that the place didn't look nice anymore or something, and we just had to encourage people to self-organize, because what you're doing is self-organization, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. And it helps people feel as if they're buying in to the ownership. Yeah. I do also want to mention, though, that once people are very old, they still want to stay in their flat, but they don't want to be involved. And I think we have to respect that too, that there comes a point where people just do sort of get more insular. At least some people do.
Can I ask a very specific question? Do you believe you're really older people, do they enjoy watching the younger people?
Sometimes they do, yes. And mostly, we don't have, this is a 3-story building, and we don't have a lift. But the very elderly people live on the ground floor, and they can sit in their living room and they can watch the others of us doing gardening. And people always offer, if someone is really not well, they offer to go to the store for them. And these days, with all the isolation, people are offering to help one another, to do things, to shop for each other and things like that. Down the street at Alma Court, I believe it is. It's a little crescent off of Alma Terrace. Yeah. There's a community garden that the residents have developed, a vegetable garden. In the middle of there's a communal area in the middle, and it's just wonderful. It's not required, but a lot of the residents participate. And you see, they have there's a tree, and they've made a swing with a rope hanging from the tree, and the kids play in that area, and everybody really respects this garden. People don't. They don't steal the produce. They, the people who work it use it, and that seems to be working really well too. Anyway.
I think what I connect there is passive, the elderly having an opportunity to passively enjoy the garden.
Yes.
And watch people, but also in a way, in the Alma Court scenarios, there's always a common interest in looking together after the central space, because the way how you look into the space.
About resilience with xeriscaping, that's going to be really key to make sure the planting is, the brief enables areas to be, the planting to be appropriate. So it's a matter of choice how much involvement the residents need, because you don't want something that becomes a chore. It's meant to be a joy for those to participate in, to whatever level they want to be engaged in. Surely you should be trying to build in some water harvesting on the outset, engage with other groups, periphery groups that you've got in the environment. Yeah. They might be, the York Cemetery already has a significant body of interest in volunteers and about external environment. Blueberry Academy does. So yes, completely agree with Margaret there. If you engage with Brunswick early, you get their buy-in to it.
You need to allow people to connect.
Because if you just view it as those immediate residents, you've not got resilience for when, like Margaret says, there'll be a time where some of them have got, the younger ones have got young families, and the older ones maybe are physically less able. Whereas if you have a broader, more a wider, less ghettoized model, being more resilient, you've got, we've got Edible York, we've got Pocket Park, York Civic Trust, Pocket Parks. We've got so many wonderful things going on. Make sure they're plugged in from the outset.
But sort of invite people.
I think it's really been exciting to hear about the types of places in the wider community and communal sort of gardens and groups of people living in close proximity that works already, because I think we've always seen the site of Ordnance Lane at different scales, and it's about the connection to the wider community and that what that does for the communal places. And then there's sort of the mid-range size where we've got these sort of courtyards which are going to be intergenerational places. There's wheelchair adaptable flats on the ground floor of those courtyards, there's family homes, there's walk-up flats. I'm excited to see how that sort of happens naturally. And then there is this part of the site where we're concentrating more and maybe designing it more specifically with intergenerational people in mind. The project has the chance to work at all different scales, which is really exciting. I have a question, Lydia, maybe, who I think knows a huge amount of this stuff, and I wonder why she thinks perhaps there aren't so many schemes in the UK, and possibly why the UK has been held back a little bit compared to other countries, especially sort of Scandinavian countries in Europe.
Yeah, so I think actually one of the reasons it hasn't happened so much here in the UK already is how I started the presentation, talking about the fact there's this big divide in the UK between generations, and that's come, I think, partly because we build like student housing. Like, I studied my undergraduate in Nottingham, and there was a student area of the city that was exclusively students, and students didn't live anywhere else in the city. And then you have these places, I think also because of the politics in the country over the last few decades. There's been a big wealth divide between older people and younger people that's kind of been growing, which means because of that wealth divide, there's been changes in where people live, where people can afford to live. So people that can afford to live in suburbs, for example, do. Younger people end up often living in city centres because that's where they can afford to live. So this division that's happened in our cities on that big scale means that there's been this divide in how we're even thinking about how we live. And I think that's held back the UK. And that's like created this divide in attitudes, as I was saying. And I think that really puts people off even the idea of it. So, for example, that scheme, Lowry House in Haringey, some of the other interviews I've heard between residents, their conception of the idea of having young people live in the house beforehand was like, but they're all going to be drug addicts, they're all going to, be partying all night, this is what the residents are saying. And then when the scheme actually happened, it's been really successful. But it's these misconceptions people have about the other generations. So I think one of the ways of addressing that is marketing. So however, York decides to do this, and at Ordnance Lane, I think the way it's marketed will be really important in challenging some of these misconceptions people have about other generations. And I think the reason this hasn't happened quite so much in other places, like for example in Denmark where I've been studying, you just don't have student living quite the same way. Like students live all across the city and the halls of residence are completely spread out everywhere in lots of different places and in a more kind of communal way. So like for example, I lived next door to and above and below were kind of middle-aged families, and mine was kind of marketed as a student flat. And I think all of those things kind of help to foster a more aged, integrated community, which make people feel more comfortable about doing intergenerational living.
The community of interest, the spatial configuration that let a lot of things happening without really sort of forcing stuff. I'd love to hear a bit more about government intervention. There was sort of a policy direction and a strategic objective of helping these things. Also some external funding that allowed some of these aspects to happen. Maybe you could expand a little bit on sort of these two aspects.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is just something that happens naturally in communities. When communities get together, people find things that they're interested in. In that example, the artists in residence example, it was really clear that that they'd specifically chosen art students had really fostered those relationships. But I was thinking about this idea of the self-build and also some of the ideas about the live-work intergenerational. I think that could be something really exciting for fostering like shared interest between people. I was thinking, you could have some kind of matching up of somebody that's working in a certain field, kind of matching up residents that work in similar areas and have similar interests in ideas coming forward for Ordnance Lane. I think the idea of a shared living space is really good, but from all of the examples I've looked at, communal kitchens are really key in getting communities together, because people just love having shared meals and places where they can all cook together and dine together. The thing I was thinking about some of these outdoor spaces as well is some of the schemes I've looked at that I think work really well is if there's a kind of spectrum of indoor to outdoor spaces. So, for example, garden rooms I think is a really great thing to be shared, because it's something that maybe is quite expensive for everyone to have on their own apartments, but a really fantastic thing that everyone, people could go in there and sit and read and chat, and a way of meeting other people, and such an asset. And then outdoor spaces that are sheltered but outside, just I think a range of like very sunny bits and things. If you're really designing that outdoor space, raised beds are just fantastic for a range of ages.
Quite lucky in Ordnance Lane, so we have a nursery literally at the edge of the site, and so historically our site used to be a nursery, so there even is sort of historic narrative that you can and should prolong particular, and then you can link it with resilience and our strategic brief.
I've really enjoyed everything. Can you see the river? Can you see the sunset from within the development? You're a young person with limitations, and it's those limitations which need to be managed. Think about your planting beds. The raised beds, fantastic. The hose pipes that you can get to, fantastic. Everything you need to manage the expectations. You're also designing in many of the houses, resilience and flexibility. Please don't lose sight of them when you're designing the outside spaces as well. Don't think gardens last forever. They don't. People do, not the gardens. And they will have different needs at different times. The outside spaces, please make them variable and resilient as well. I live in a small development of 21 flats just up the river from where you are now, where the two rivers, the Foss and the Ouse, join. There are 21 flats in 3 blocks, and we have a wonderful community of fine people who are largely more aged rather than elderly. And we do contribute towards the management of the properties ourselves. It is a leasehold situation, so there is a freeholder. We help each other. They're elective living.
Mm-hmm.
They elect, they choose, they put themselves on the list to live there when they're in their 40s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's elective. It's places where people want to go.
So that element of choice that you choose, I think that seems to be quite an important.
It is important. It's also important to choose where you relate to inside the building.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many old nursing homes
Mm-hmm.
that have a large community space and they're dead.
I think we sometimes call this sort of coincidental meeting is much more important than organized spaces. I mean, that stands slightly in contrast to what we heard earlier about the communal kitchen. But
that's communal dining.
You could, oh, there you go.
I live in Alma Grove, which is just down the road from Fulford Road and Alma Terrace. So I've got a couple of points really. First of all, Alma Grove is, I think it was social housing and it's now majoritarily owned by privately owned. But it's a very good example of mixed age community. There are 30 houses. I've just been looking out at the central green and there's a family out there, and families have decided at this time to take it in turns to use the green. So there's a family out there playing badminton. There's elderly couple who would have been proactive in the garden earlier on. But interestingly enough, that garden, which is fantastic, is really run by about 3 families. And if they were to go, and it's to do with the sustainability really, if they were to down fork or to move somewhere else, I'm not sure what would happen to the gardens. We have no formal committee or anything like that. But we get on and there is a general respect. And it is nice to see the swings and such like there. And it generally works really, really well. So that's for us is a very positive experience. My main point was, we talked about students and sort of student areas of towns. I've increasingly got involved with visiting elderly folk who've become good friends in various setups, both in York and in other places. And a lot of these organisations are run by private companies. So I've been visiting Connaught Court, for example, which is in Fulford until fairly recently, and a couple of other places. And there are a lot of barriers there that would, I can just see Connaught Court, and if you could fill some of those rooms with families or younger children, or even use the bungalows in the front of Connaught Court, which are available and are empty at the moment, and put in families and younger people, it would be fantastic. You know, that presentation we had was super. But it's about how you would work, how you get through to, first of all, the elderly people and the organisations that seem to own these places. Because to my knowledge, they're charities or they're private organisations and they're money making. And they tend to be away from everywhere else. So there's a new place opening up at the bottom of Fulford, for example. I'm interested in this because I would like to be into living in this place at Ordnance Lane when I'm older, because I want that as my choice. I want to start making choices now as a 60-year-old as to where I want to be at 70. And I assume I want to be surrounded by younger children because I very much enjoy younger children. And I assume what I'd like to be active. I don't want to be in a home at the edge of town.
In part, it might have something to do also being fragile, and you don't want to expose yourself too much of a much faster moving younger generation. But you still like to be somehow involved. And I always remember when, I think the Italians getting this so often so right, on a lot of Italian squares, even in smaller villages, there's something what is called pro loco, where you basically have a place for the older people. There are chairs outside of the square. There's a little water fountain usually, and they all sit there all day. I don't quite know what they're doing.
Perfect.
It's lovely.
Perfect.
But they basically sit there in the shade. The dog is coming along for the water. The market is happening down the road. And they're just enjoying being part, but not actively in that sense engaged.
I mean, I know too many people who've made the move too late. So they've got to 75, 80, and suddenly for all sorts of their own personal reasons, they've got to move from their, if you like, family home. And maybe if these places are attractive enough, then we're going at a younger age. I'm not sure. I know everybody's circumstances are very different.
design it well, there's a lot of interest, but there's also something about something that adds, maybe not size, because you're actually probably going to downsize from where you, with the attractiveness of the space, the quality of your environment to make sort of good, because we also hear often it's the memories. It's not the actual items that you're worried about, but it's the memories that are attached to the items in your bigger house.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in what Kirsty's saying, and as you, but to have that choice of helping, designing our own space, I suppose, to live in. And I think that's, you know, in order to create a community, you have to give people a feeling that they have a say in what's going on in their community, to feel that they have a say in how they're living their life. That's what, you know, that's what keeps people involved. That's what keeps people young. And I mean, I think it's really important for people's mental health as well, actually, to do this while you're still active and able and can have the energy to create a life that will be flexible enough to see you into your older age, really.
I'd like to hear from sort of across the board, maybe a bit of a view on how do you think people would sort of respond in York, in your part of York, if there would be sort of a list of criteria and they had to sort of apply to potentially to move in, basically.
I think you'd have to educate people. I think people do tend to be, the English do tend to be quite isolated compared with a lot of more European things. You talk about Italy, and you know you see that people are much more involved across generations. This experience, in a way, of isolation, you know, especially for those of us who live alone, it's going to make people think differently and see the importance of a good neighbourhood where you do know your neighbours, where you are more perhaps enmeshed in people's lives, where older people are involved with younger people, and we all can feel useful to each other and connected. And so I think it might, you know, I think the world might change, and possibly it'll become more open to this sort of thing. I mean, certainly if we are successful in creating our community, we will expect people to sign up for certain neighbourly, you know, to be involved in the community, to help run the community, to you can't just be a passenger, you've got to be an active member. Obviously, if you're ill or as you age, that might become, you might be doing different things, or you might be able to do less. Start with, I think people might be more engaged, more open to it in the future.
I think it's a very important point you make in there, because we're all living in something nobody would have thought is ever possible a few weeks ago. But that sort of level of isolation, and also maybe realizing how nice it feels if you do help somebody. A quarter of the Earth population is doing versions of this now. So there's a good chance that things will change. Can I just hear a few more sort of views on the sort of setting criteria to move into sort of a place of a sort of a culture? Hi, Caroline.
I was just thinking about the strategic, given that we're a local authority, and obviously we have housing strategic priorities, and listening to what Lydia said, particularly around the models of supporting foster families, families with adopted children, single parents, I'm just wondering how we can link some of the other council priorities we may be looking to deliver housing solutions to as part of this project. And I haven't got the answer to that now, but in terms of looking wider and working with Lisa over how we could support some of those other adult social care concerns we have within the city. I know there's a major issue in relation to fostering, for instance, and a shortage of fostering placements. And I thought that was the ones that Lydia was talking about were excellent examples of how families can be well supported by older, more mature people. So I was just throwing that really in the ring for you to maybe pick up at a later point.
So just to back up that point, without giving too much away, as an adoptive parent of a 5-year-old as she was then, to live in a community like I'm living in now, with these 30 houses that we're not in and out of each other's homes. I mean, up until 2 weeks ago, there were some people I'd never spoken to. And there's still people I haven't spoken to. But it is fabulous to bring up a child who has had, in whatever experience they've had, to be in a sort of fairly safe environment, because, well, it's not isolated, we're not locked in, but it feels like a definite community, unlike a long street, for example, or a bigger estate. And so she did get the opportunity of knowing local people. So I can understand how useful that would be, to be honest. The other thing about what you were just talking about in terms of criteria for moving into housing things, I think there's a younger generation now that Britain used to be something like 70% we used to own their own homes, and there's a real shift now to people renting. So people are much more used to making choices about where they're going to live and change quite regularly the environments they're living in. So they're being a bit more, I think that might help in terms of the future, in terms of people be willing to think about criteria that are needed for living in certain places. Because I've only lived in about 4 different places in my life. And I think if you're renting and you're moving around a little bit, you're perhaps a bit more open-minded. I don't know.
And is it that even more important if you have more people coming in and out into your community to have a shared culture? So
I just think there's more people now, I don't know, probably moving more frequently, but in a mixed environment, in a smaller scale environment than an anonymous street in London, for example. Sort of give them some footing and a bit of security, and allow them to know a greater range of people.
I mean, it's interesting. There's sort of a basic principle about mixing brings resilience, doesn't it? All sorts of life forms, basically.
There are criteria for students to live in student housing, and there are criteria for seniors to live in seniors, nursing homes and things like that. And but that leads to that ghettoization. So on the other hand, if there's no criteria, then you're not sure how it's going to end up. Somebody's permanent residence, that they were going to actually live there. I think that would be my number one criteria, was that they were actually going to live there full time, not flit in and out, and to be part of the community.
I think setting out the criteria is a whole task in itself. And we do have a very strong design agenda already with passive house, energy efficiency, trees and green. So there is already quite a lot of the culture is almost already, it exists almost in our design brief in that sense. But there's obviously a whole other aspect of it.
I think is really important, and that I've really noticed when looking at other schemes, is that the schemes that have quite a selective process are really effective at bringing in the people that maybe are actually in most need of this housing, this type of intergenerational housing, because I think there's a danger that if you make it open to everyone, which is obviously wonderful, and I think there is room for housing to do that, but to target those people that are kind of isolated in their homes, in the suburbs, not interacting with anyone, not mixing with any other generations or, any family, by offering this kind of intergenerational setups to those people, I think that's where you're having kind of the most impact, if you have the opportunity to be selective in that way as a council with social housing. So I think that's something that could be really fantastic. I think, of course, having an open community is also wonderful though. So perhaps that's where maybe it comes into play that you have a mixture, where there are some homes that are designated for those most in need and those most vulnerable, perhaps with the lowest income. That's some of how some of the other models selected people were those that were financially most in need, basically. Yeah, and then having a mixture of other people that are very open-minded already about living in these communities, who would be willing to kind of charge forward with creating the community, and having that mixture of people would be really successful.
I think that's probably a good point, but I think what that Mary's put on the thing about having a few people who are really active, and I suppose that's what Lydia was saying too. You need those sort of driving forces of people who are willing to put themselves out there and be active in the community. And actually, Kirsty said the same about her. You know, the people who create the garden in the middle. It's probably a few people who actually are the seed spreads out to other people. But it's also to do with the design. I mean, it's a hugely different thing if you've got a long street of houses, or if you've got something like you have at Alma Grove, where you've got houses around a square. You know, that encourages more social interaction. People see each other more. So a lot has to do with design, and making those spaces so that people naturally interact, so they naturally come across each other. Their paths.
Dennis is applauding. I don't know if you've seen that. So I can see applause to all the speakers again, because the presentations were wonderful.
Yeah, just to say thank you to everyone, and to Angela for testing this out on this, because it's been I know it's been quite stressful for you, but I think it's worked really well, and we've got a huge amount to come away with, and really wonderful positive things that I feel comfortable that we've explored some of them, and we've started to talk about them as a sort of design team and project team. But I feel that I've gained much more of an understanding of how we can sort of progress with this now. So it's been really wonderful.